Welcome back to HOA Debrief. The gate hinge was in my hand and the fine was in her mouth. You are about to get another letter. That was the first thing Kathleen Robinson said when she came storming across my yard, pointing at the fence panel I had just laid flat on the grass. She was waving a bundle of zip ties like she was about to tie me to a post, and her face was already red before she even finished the sentence. A fence panel, sitting on my own grass, and she was calling it a fire hazard. I work as an HVAC technician. I am always on call, and I had run outside the second I heard her voice because I knew if I did not get ahead of this, she would manufacture a crisis I could not afford. I need to keep my record clean because of background checks at work, and Kathleen knew that. She knew everything about everyone in Briarwood Commons Association, and she used it. She stepped closer, close enough that I could see the little red capillaries in her eyes, and she said it again. You are about to get another letter. I pointed at the panel and asked her what exactly the violation was. She did not even look at me. She looked at the panel, then at the gate a few feet away, then back at me, and she said the panel was creating a fire escape obstruction and I was required to remove it immediately or she would cite me for non-compliance with the landscaping and safety addendum. I asked her which addendum. She said she did not have time to educate me on the rules I had already signed. I told her I had read every page of the covenant, and there was nothing in there about a fence panel on the grass. She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made my stomach drop. I do not negotiate with violations, she said. That is her line. She says it every time, like it is supposed to end the conversation. The board will back me, because they are afraid of me. She said that part out loud too, right there in front of the fence panel, like she wanted me to know she had already won. I could see a teen on a bike braking hard at the end of the driveway, craning his neck to watch, and I knew this was going to be all over the neighborhood group chat within 10 minutes. Briarwood Commons Association is the kind of place where group emails are used like public shaming posters. You do not get a private warning. You get a thread with 30 replies and your address in the subject line. Kathleen turned and started taking pictures of the panel with her phone. I asked her what she was doing. She said she was documenting the violation for the compliance file in the fire marshal review. I told her the fire marshal was not going to care about a fence panel on private property. She stopped, looked at me like I had just insulted her children, and said I clearly did not understand the scope of the issue. Then she pulled out her phone and started typing something. I knew she was sending it to the board, maybe to the management company, maybe to the vendor she uses for every enforcement action. She has a tow authorization placard she keeps in her car, a little magnetic thing the tow driver flashes whenever she calls him, and I had seen it twice already this year on other people's driveways. She finished typing and looked up at me. She said a vendor would be at my door within the hour to verify fence compliance and that I needed to stay on the property so they could access the full perimeter. I asked her who authorized a vendor to come onto my property. She said the covenant granted the HOA easement access for inspection and enforcement, and if I interfered, I would be in breach. I told her I wanted to see that easement language in writing. She said the fence guideline was confidential and subject to board discretion, and I was not entitled to a copy unless I filed a formal records request. I asked her how I was supposed to comply with a guideline I was not allowed to read. She said that was my problem, not hers, and she walked back toward the street. I stood there in my yard staring at the fence panel trying to figure out what had just happened. The panel was not even installed yet. I had pulled the old one off that morning because it was rotted through at the bottom rail, and I was planning to set the new one in after lunch. Now Kathleen was claiming it was a safety hazard and I was about to get hit with another notice. I had already received 3 letters this year. One for a trash can left out 6 hours past collection time. One for a garden hose visible from the street. One for a contractor truck parked in my driveway for 40 minutes while the guy checked my furnace. Every letter came certified. Every letter had a 14-day response window, and every letter threatened escalating fines if I did not provide written proof of correction. I went inside and pulled up the covenant on my laptop. I had the whole thing saved as a searchable file because I knew this was coming. I had been in Briarwood Commons for 8 months, and I had watched Kathleen target 4 other homeowners with the same playbook. She picks someone, she finds a violation, and then she floods them with paperwork until they either give up or sell. I was not going to be number 5. I searched the covenant for fence, fire, panel, safety, and easement. The only fence language I found was a restriction on height over 6 feet and a material restriction that banned chain link. Nothing about panels on the ground, nothing about fire hazards, nothing about vendor access without written notice. 30 minutes later, a white pickup pulled up in front of my house. The guy who got out was wearing a contractor vest and carrying a clipboard. He walked straight onto my lawn without knocking, went to the fence line and started measuring the setback from the property line with a tape measure. I opened the door and asked him who sent him. He said he was contracted through the management company to verify compliance with the boundary easement and structure placement requirements. I asked him if he had a work order. He said he did not need one because the HOA had blanket authorization for inspections. I told him I wanted to see documentation of that authorization before he measured anything else. He ignored me and kept measuring. I walked over and asked him again. He stood up, looked me in the eye, and said if I interfered with an authorized inspection, the HOA could fine me for obstruction and escalate to a lien if I did not cooperate. I asked him who told him that. He said Kathleen Robinson, HOA president. I told him Kathleen did not have the authority to authorize inspections without written notice, and I wanted him off my property. He said he was just doing his job and he had 3 more houses to check today. Then he folded up the tape measure, made a note on his clipboard, and walked back to his truck. Before he drove off, he leaned out the window and said I should expect another letter. I went back inside and called the management company. I got a voicemail. I left a message asking for clarification on the vendor authorization policy and the easement access rules, and I said I wanted a written response within 48 hours. Then I called a friend of mine who works in city code enforcement. His name is Miguel, and I met him on a job site 2 years ago when I was doing an HVAC install in a municipal building. He has seen every kind of HOA nonsense, and he knows what is actually enforceable and what is just intimidation. I told him what happened. He laughed, then stopped laughing and said I needed to start keeping timestamps on everything because Kathleen was setting me up for a process ambush. Miguel said the fire hazard claim was garbage. A fence panel on private property is not a code violation unless it is blocking a public right-of-way or creating an actual obstruction. And even then, the city has to issue the notice, not the HOA. He said the vendor inspection was also sketchy because most HOAs can only inspect common areas or shared structures without a formal complaint process. He told me to check the covenant for the exact language on inspections and easements, and if it was vague, I should demand a clarification in writing before I let anyone else on my property. He also said I should start recording every interaction with Kathleen and the board, because once they start targeting someone, they do not stop until they get what they want. I thanked him and hung up. Then I opened my laptop and started a new folder. I labeled it Briarwood Commons Evidence. I saved every email, every letter, every photograph, and every voicemail Kathleen had sent me since I moved in. I also saved the covenant, the bylaws, and the meeting minutes from the last 6 months. I kept my phone in my pocket because I was saving one clip for the finale. I had something Kathleen did not know about, and I was not going to show my hand until I had no other choice. That evening I got an email. It was from the Briarwood Commons Management Company, and it was addressed to me and copied to Kathleen and the entire board. The subject line said Violation Notice Docket Update. The email said I was being cited for unauthorized construction activity and failure to obtain pre-approval for structural modifications. It said I had 10 days to submit a written compliance plan, including a licensed contractor's certification, proof of permit, and a revised site plan showing setback measurements. If I did not respond, the HOA would proceed with daily fines starting at $50 per day, and the matter would be referred to the board for a formal hearing. The email also said the fence panel was required to be removed within 48 hours, and if I failed to comply, the HOA would arrange removal at my expense. I read it 3 times. Then I checked the covenant again. There was no language requiring pre-approval for replacing a fence panel on an existing structure. The fence was already there. I was swapping one panel for another. The height was the same. The material was the same. I was not building anything new. I called Miguel again. He said it sounded like they were trying to force me into a hearing where they could control the narrative and stack the vote against me. He said I should respond in writing, cite the specific covenant sections that allowed the repair, and demand a copy of the guideline they were claiming I violated. He also said I should file a formal records request for all vendor contracts, inspection authorizations, and any communications between Kathleen and the management company about my property. I spent the next 2 days drafting my response. I kept it short, factual, and referenced every relevant section of the covenant. I included photos of the old fence panel showing the rot damage, photos of the new panel, and a diagram showing the fence line matched the original setback. I also included a formal records request asking for the fence guideline, the vendor authorization policy, and any communications about my property. I sent it certified mail to the management company and copied Kathleen and the board. I kept a time-stamped copy in my evidence folder. If you want to see what happens when HOA boards try to bury you in paperwork, hit like and subscribe because this gets so much worse. 3 days later, I got another email. This one was from Kathleen directly, not the management company. It said the board had reviewed my response and determined that my interpretation of the covenant was incorrect. It said the board had broad discretion to enforce safety and aesthetic standards, and the fence guideline was classified as a working document subject to periodic updates and not available for public distribution. It said I was required to attend a mandatory compliance meeting on Thursday at 7 in the evening at the community center, and failure to attend would result in an automatic fine and escalation to the attorney. I forwarded the email to Miguel. He called me back within an hour. He said the working document excuse was a red flag because it meant they could change the rules retroactively, and you would never know what you were supposed to follow. He said I should show up to the meeting with a witness, record everything, and demand a copy of the guideline in writing. He also said I should check the bylaws to see if they were required to give me advance notice of the agenda and whether I had the right to speak. I checked. The bylaws said homeowners had the right to address the board during the open comment period, but the board could limit speaking time at their discretion. There was no requirement for advance notice of the agenda. Thursday came. I drove to the community center with Miguel. He said he would sit in the back and take notes, and if things got out of hand, he would jump in. The meeting room was set up with a long table at the front for the board and rows of folding chairs facing them. Kathleen was already there, sitting in the center seat with 2 other board members on either side. There were maybe 10 other homeowners scattered in the chairs, most of them looking uncomfortable. I signed in at the door and took a seat in the second row. Kathleen looked at me, then looked at Miguel, and her expression tightened. The meeting started with the usual board business: budget updates, landscaping vendor reports, upcoming holiday decorations policy. Kathleen read through each item in a monotone voice, and the other board members nodded along. No one asked questions. No one objected. It was clear this was her show. Then she got to the enforcement report. She said there had been an increase in covenant violations over the past quarter, and the board was taking a more proactive approach to compliance. She said several homeowners were currently under review, and the board expected full cooperation with inspections and corrective actions. Then she looked directly at me and said she wanted to address one case in particular. She said I had been cited for unauthorized construction and failure to respond to multiple violation notices. I stood up and said I had responded in writing with documentation and a formal records request. She said my response was insufficient because it did not include the required contractor certification or proof of permit. I said the covenant did not require a permit for replacing a fence panel on an existing structure. She said the board had discretion to require additional documentation for any structural work, and I had failed to comply. I asked her to cite the specific section of the covenant that gave the board that authority. She said it was covered under the general maintenance and safety provisions, and she did not need to explain the board's reasoning to me. I asked her again for a copy of the fence guideline. She said it was not available. I asked her how I was supposed to comply with a rule I was not allowed to read. She said the guideline was applied on a case-by-case basis, and if I had questions I could submit them in writing and the board would respond at their discretion. I said that was not how rules work. She banged her hand on the table and said I was out of order, and if I continued to disrupt the meeting, she would have me removed. Miguel stood up in the back and said he was a city code enforcement officer, and he would like to clarify a few points about what the HOA could and could not enforce. Kathleen looked at him, then looked at me and said the board did not recognize non-homeowner commentary during enforcement proceedings. The meeting went downhill from there. Kathleen said the board was moving forward with daily fines starting immediately, and I had 7 days to submit a revised compliance plan or the matter would be referred to the HOA attorney for lien proceedings. I asked her if I could speak during the open comment period. She said the open comment period had been moved to the end of the meeting, and we were not there yet. I sat down. Miguel sat down. Kathleen moved on to the next agenda item like nothing had happened. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I knew this was the setup. She was going to run out the clock, skip my comment period, and push the vote through before I had a chance to defend myself. 20 minutes later, she said the board was moving into executive session to discuss legal matters, and the public portion of the meeting was adjourned. I stood up and said I had not been given a chance to speak. She said the open comment period was discretionary, and the board had decided to defer public comment to the next meeting. I said the bylaws guaranteed homeowners the right to address the board. She said the bylaws also gave the board discretion to manage meeting time, and the decision was final. Then she stood up, gathered her papers, and walked toward the side door. The other board members followed her. Miguel and I were left standing in the meeting room with the other homeowners, all of us staring at each other. I walked outside and called my wife. I told her what happened. She said I needed to get a lawyer because this was not going to stop. I said I did not have the money for a lawyer, and I was not going to let Kathleen bully me into selling the house just to make her feel powerful. She said I needed to do something before the fines started piling up. I told her I had a plan, and I needed her to trust me. Then I hung up and called Miguel. He said what just happened was probably a violation of the open meeting rules and I should file a complaint with the state. He also said I should start documenting every interaction with Kathleen and the board, because if this went to court, I was going to need a timeline that showed a pattern of retaliation. The next morning, I got a certified letter. It was the official violation notice, typed on HOA letterhead, signed by Kathleen, and dated the day of the meeting. It said I was being fined $50 per day starting immediately, and the fines would continue until I submitted a compliant correction plan. It also said the HOA had scheduled a fence removal for the following Tuesday, and if I did not remove the panel myself, the HOA would hire a contractor to do it and bill me for the cost. The letter included a reference number, a due date, and a warning that failure to pay the fines would result in a lien on the property. I sat at my kitchen table and read the letter 3 times. Then I opened my evidence folder and added it to the file. I also pulled up the covenant and searched for the lien process. The covenant said the HOA could place a lien for unpaid assessments or fines, but only after a formal hearing where the homeowner had the right to present evidence and appeal the decision. I had not been given a hearing. I had been ambushed at a meeting where Kathleen cut off my speaking time and pushed through a fine without a vote. I called Miguel again. He said I needed to file a formal objection in writing and demand a hearing. He also said I should file the records request again, this time with a specific deadline, because the longer they stalled, the harder it would be to prove they were making up the rules as they went. That afternoon, I drafted my objection. I cited the bylaws requirement for a hearing, the lack of advance notice, and the fact that Kathleen had denied me the opportunity to speak. I also included a second formal records request, this time with a 30-day deadline and a list of specific documents. I sent it certified mail to the management company, the board, and Kathleen. I kept a time-stamped copy. Then I went outside and finished installing the fence panel. It took me 20 minutes. The panel fit perfectly into the existing frame and the setback matched the original line. I took photos of the completed work, time-stamped them, and added them to my evidence folder. 2 days later, a tow truck pulled up in front of my house. The driver got out and walked up to my driveway. I opened the door and asked him what he wanted. He said he had a call to tow a vehicle for HOA violation. I told him there was no vehicle in violation. He said he had a work order from Kathleen Robinson authorizing a tow for a contractor truck parked in the driveway. I told him there was no contractor truck, and there had not been one for over a week. He pulled out a magnetic placard from his cab, the same tow authorization placard I had seen before, and said he was authorized by the HOA to enforce parking violations. I told him if he towed my truck, I would file a police report for vehicle theft. He looked at me, looked at the driveway, and said he would call his dispatcher. He got back in his cab and drove off. I called Miguel immediately. I told him what happened. He said Kathleen was escalating because she knew I was not backing down, and she was trying to provoke me into doing something she could use against me. He said I needed to stay calm, document everything, and let her keep digging her own hole. He also said I should check the covenant to see if the HOA had any authority to authorize tows on private property. I checked. The covenant allowed the HOA to tow vehicles parked in common areas or blocking access to shared amenities, but it said nothing about towing vehicles on private driveways. I added that to my evidence file. That evening I got a call from a neighbor 2 houses down. Her name is Linda, and we had talked a few times at the mailbox. She said Kathleen had come to her door that afternoon and asked her to sign a complaint about my fence. Linda said Kathleen told her the fence was a safety hazard and was lowering property values, and if Linda did not sign, Kathleen would find other violations to target her with. Linda refused. Kathleen said she would be sorry, and she left. Linda called me because she wanted me to know what Kathleen was doing. She also said 2 other neighbors had told her the same thing, and both of them had signed because they were afraid of retaliation. I thanked Linda and told her I was sorry she got dragged into this. She said I should not apologize because Kathleen was the one out of control and someone needed to stop her before she destroyed the whole neighborhood. I told her I was working on it and I would let her know when I had news. Then I hung up and called Miguel. I told him what Linda said. He said that was witness intimidation, and if I could get Linda to put it in writing, I could use it as evidence that Kathleen was abusing her position. I texted Linda and asked if she would write down what happened. She said yes, and she sent me a short statement that night. I printed it, dated it, and added it to my evidence folder. The next day I got a notice in the mail. It was from the Briarwood Commons Management Company, and it said a mandatory compliance inspection had been scheduled for the following Monday at 10 in the morning. It said the inspection would include a full perimeter survey, setback measurements, and a review of all exterior structures. It said I was required to be present and provide access to the property, and failure to comply would result in additional fines and enforcement action. The notice also said a licensed surveyor would be conducting the inspection, and the cost would be billed to my account. I called Miguel. He said this was it. This was the escalation I had been waiting for. Kathleen was bringing in a surveyor to try to find something, anything that she could use to justify the fines and the removal. He said I needed to be there, I needed to record everything, and I needed to have my own documentation ready in case the surveyor tried to manipulate the measurements. He also said I should call the surveyor's office ahead of time and ask for a copy of their work order so I knew exactly what they were being asked to do. I called the surveying company. The receptionist said she could not give me that information without authorization from the client. I asked who the client was. She said Briarwood Commons Association. I thanked her and hung up. Monday morning came. I was outside at 9:45 waiting. Miguel showed up at 9:50 with a tape measure and a copy of the original property survey from when I bought the house. He said he wanted to be there in case the surveyor tried anything shady. At 10 on the dot, a white pickup pulled up, and a guy in a reflective vest got out with a tripod and a laser level. He introduced himself as the surveyor, set up his equipment at the corner of my lot, and started taking measurements. Kathleen showed up 5 minutes later. She parked on the street and walked straight over to the surveyor. She did not acknowledge me. She did not acknowledge Miguel. She stood next to the tripod and started pointing at the fence line. I walked over and asked the surveyor what he was measuring. He said he was verifying the property line and the setback distance for the fence. I asked him who ordered the survey. He said the HOA. I asked him if he had a copy of the work order. He said he did not need to show me that. Kathleen stepped between us and said I was interfering with an authorized inspection, and if I did not step back, she would call the police. I told her I had every right to be present on my own property during a survey. Miguel stepped forward and said he was a city code enforcement officer, and he wanted to verify the surveyor's credentials and the scope of the work order. Kathleen said Miguel had no authority here, and the HOA had exclusive jurisdiction over covenant enforcement. Miguel said that was not how jurisdiction works, and if the surveyor was making findings that would be used for enforcement, the homeowner had the right to verify the accuracy of those findings. The surveyor stopped working and looked at Kathleen. He said he was not going to continue if this turned into a legal argument, and he needed clarification from the client about the scope of the inspection. Kathleen said the scope was already defined in the work order, and the surveyor needed to complete the job. The surveyor said he wanted written confirmation that the HOA had authorization to conduct a full boundary survey, because that was different from a simple setback check. Kathleen pulled out her phone and started typing. The surveyor waited. Miguel and I waited. 2 minutes later, Kathleen got a reply. She showed the surveyor her phone screen. The surveyor nodded and went back to his equipment. Miguel leaned over to me and whispered that Kathleen just made a mistake. She showed the surveyor a communication on her phone, and that communication was now evidence that the HOA was directing the surveyor's findings. If the survey came back in her favor, we could argue that it was biased and demand a neutral third-party review. I nodded. I kept my face blank. Kathleen was too focused on the surveyor to notice. The surveyor spent the next hour setting up sightlines, taking measurements, and checking the fence posts against the property pins. Kathleen stood next to him the whole time, watching every move. Miguel and I stood on the porch, taking notes. At one point, Kathleen walked over to the fence and tried to nudge one of the survey stakes with her foot. The surveyor saw her and told her not to touch anything. She stepped back, but I caught it on my phone. Miguel saw it too. He said that was tampering, and if the survey came back with findings that contradicted the original plat, we could use that footage to challenge the results. The surveyor finished his work and packed up his equipment. He said he would send the findings to the HOA within 3 business days. Kathleen thanked him and walked back to her car. Before she left, she turned and looked at me. She said I should expect the final compliance deadline notice by the end of the week, and if I did not meet the requirements, the HOA would move forward with forced removal and lien proceedings. Then she got in her car and drove off. Miguel and I went inside. He said the survey was going to be the turning point because if it came back showing the fence was inside the setback, Kathleen would have no grounds for enforcement, and the whole case would collapse. If it came back showing the fence was over the line, I would need to prove the surveyor was wrong, and that would mean hiring my own surveyor, which would cost money I did not have. I told him I was not worried about the survey because I had the original plat, and the fence was exactly where it had always been. He said I should still be ready for her to twist the results, because that was what she did. 3 days later, I got an email from the management company. It included an attached survey report. The report said the fence was encroaching on the HOA common area easement by 6 inches along a 12-foot section, and the encroachment created a liability risk for the association. It said the fence needed to be moved or removed within 10 days, and failure to comply would result in the HOA exercising its right to remove the structure and bill the homeowner for costs. The report was signed by the surveyor and notarized. I opened the original plat and compared the measurements. The fence was exactly where it had been for the last 15 years, long before I bought the house. The easement line on the survey report did not match the easement line on the plat. I measured it myself with Miguel's tape measure, and the fence was 2 feet inside my property line, nowhere near the easement. I called Miguel and told him. He said the survey was bogus, and the surveyor either made a mistake or was told to make a mistake. He said I needed to challenge the findings immediately and demand a third-party review. He also said I should file a complaint with the state surveying board because falsifying a boundary survey was a serious violation. I drafted a response that night. I included a side-by-side comparison of the survey report and the original plat, with measurements and photographs. I cited the discrepancy and demanded an independent survey at the HOA's expense. I also included a formal complaint to the state surveying board, with a copy of the survey report and the original plat. I sent everything certified mail to the management company, the board, Kathleen, and the surveyor's office. I kept time-stamped copies in my evidence folder. The next day, Kathleen called me. She said the board had reviewed my response and determined that the survey was accurate and binding. She said I had 7 days to remove the fence, or the HOA would proceed with removal. I told her the survey was wrong and I had proof. She said the board did not accept homeowner-provided documentation as evidence unless it was certified by a licensed professional. I told her I would get it certified if she gave me time. She said the deadline was final, and I had already been given more time than I deserved. Then she hung up. Miguel said I needed to move fast. He said I should call a real estate attorney and see if I could get a consultation, because at this point the HOA was threatening property damage, and I needed legal advice. I called 3 attorneys. The first 2 said they did not handle HOA cases. The third one said he would talk to me for a flat fee consultation. I paid the fee and met with him the next day. He reviewed my evidence folder, the survey report, the original plat, and the timeline of letters and emails. He said I had a strong case for harassment and abuse of process, but it would take months to litigate, and the legal fees would be more than the cost of just moving the fence. I told him I was not moving the fence because I did not do anything wrong. He said that was my choice, but I should be prepared for the HOA to escalate, and if they placed a lien on my property, it would affect my credit and my ability to refinance or sell. I left the attorney's office feeling worse than when I went in. I called my wife and told her what he said. She said we should just move the fence and be done with it. I told her I was not going to let Kathleen win because she was lying about the survey. She said it was not worth losing the house over. I told her it was not about the house. It was about the fact that Kathleen was abusing her power to destroy people, and if I did not stop her, she was going to do it to someone else. She said I was being stubborn. I said I was being right. We argued. She hung up. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and went through my evidence folder again. I had letters, emails, photographs, witness statements, and the survey discrepancy. I also had the one thing Kathleen did not know about. I had kept my phone in my pocket because I was saving one clip for the finale. The clip was from a month ago, right after I moved in. I had been at the community center picking up a package, and I overheard Kathleen talking to the management company rep in the hallway. She was saying the HOA had been operating without a valid contract with the management company for over 2 years because the board had never voted to renew it, and she was keeping it quiet because if the homeowners found out, they would demand an audit and she would lose control of the vendor approvals. I recorded the whole conversation on my phone. I did not know if I would ever need it, but I kept it just in case. Now I knew I needed it. I had a document showing the management company was never properly contracted or renewed, and that meant every enforcement action they had taken on Kathleen's behalf was potentially invalid. I called Miguel and told him. He said that was the trump card and I needed to use it at the right moment. He said if I dropped it too early, Kathleen would have time to cover it up. If I waited until the final showdown, she would not have time to spin it, and the board would panic because they would be exposed to liability. The fence removal deadline was 2 days away. I got another certified letter saying the HOA had scheduled the removal for Tuesday morning at 8, and a contractor would be on site to dismantle the fence and haul it away. The letter said the cost would be billed to my account, and if I did not pay within 30 days, the HOA would place a lien on the property. The letter also said if I interfered with the removal, the HOA would seek a restraining order and additional penalties. I called Miguel. He said I needed to be there when the contractor showed up, and I needed to document everything. He also said I should call the police non-emergency line and let them know there was a potential property dispute in progress. So if things got heated, there would already be a record. I did both. Then I called the contractor's office and asked if they had a work order for my address. The receptionist said yes, and the job was scheduled for Tuesday at 8. I asked her who authorized the work. She said Briarwood Commons Association. I asked her if she could send me a copy of the work order. She said she could not do that without authorization from the client. I thanked her and hung up. Tuesday morning I was outside at 7:45. Miguel showed up at 7:50. The contractor truck pulled up at 8 on the dot. 2 guys got out, one with a toolbox and one with a pry bar. They walked up to my fence and started examining the panels. I walked over and asked them what they were doing. The guy with the toolbox said they were there to remove a fence under an HOA work order. I told them the fence was on my property and I had not authorized any removal. He said he had a signed work order from the HOA and he was going to complete the job. I told him if he damaged my fence, I would file a police report for property destruction. He said he was just doing what he was hired to do, and if I had a problem, I should take it up with the HOA. The guy with the pry bar started pulling nails out of the first panel. I told him to stop. He ignored me. Miguel stepped forward and said he was a city code enforcement officer, and he wanted to see the work order. The guy with the toolbox pulled out a clipboard and showed Miguel a 1-page form with Kathleen's signature at the bottom. Miguel took a photo of it with his phone. Then he said the work order did not include a property line certification, and if the contractor removed a fence that was on private property, the HOA and the contractor could both be liable for damages. The guy with the pry bar stopped and looked at the guy with the toolbox. The guy with the toolbox said he would call his boss. While we waited, Kathleen pulled up. She got out of her car and walked straight over to the contractor. She asked him why he had not started yet. He said there was a dispute about the property line and he wanted clarification before he proceeded. Kathleen said there was no dispute, the survey confirmed the encroachment, and the contractor was authorized to proceed immediately. The contractor said he would start once his boss confirmed the liability coverage. Kathleen said if he did not start now, she would find another contractor and he would lose the job. The contractor looked at me, looked at Miguel, and said he was going to wait for his boss. Kathleen turned to me. She said I was obstructing an authorized removal, and she was calling the police. I told her to go ahead. She pulled out her phone and dialed. 2 minutes later, a patrol car pulled up. The officer got out and asked what was going on. Kathleen said I was interfering with HOA property maintenance and threatening the contractor. I said the fence was on my property, and the HOA did not have authorization to remove it. The officer asked to see documentation. I showed him the original plat, the survey report, and the discrepancy between the two. Miguel showed him his credentials and explained the property line issue. The officer said this was a civil matter, and if there was a dispute about the property line, it needed to be resolved through the courts or a third-party arbitrator. He said he could not enforce a removal based on conflicting documents. Kathleen said the HOA had the authority to enforce covenant violations. The officer said the HOA did not have the authority to destroy private property, and if the contractor proceeded without a clear legal basis, he could be charged with vandalism. Kathleen's face went red. She said the officer was wrong and she would file a complaint with his supervisor. The officer said she was free to do that, but he was not going to stand by and watch property destruction based on an HOA work order. Then he got back in his patrol car and left. The contractor packed up his tools and said he was not proceeding without clear authorization. Kathleen screamed at him that he was in breach of contract. The contractor said he would let his boss handle it, and he drove off. Kathleen stood in my driveway, staring at the fence, her hands shaking. Then she turned to me and said I was going to regret this. I told her I had nothing to regret because I had not done anything wrong. She said the board would back me because they are afraid of me. I said that line was not going to work anymore because I had proof she was lying. She asked me what proof. I told her I had the survey discrepancy, the witness statements, and one more thing she did not know about. She asked me what. I told her she would find out at the next board meeting, and she should make sure the HOA attorney was there because she was going to need legal advice. She stared at me for a long moment. Then she got in her car and drove off. Miguel and I went inside. He said I had just backed her into a corner, and she was going to come at me with everything she had left. I told him I was ready. He said I better be, because the next few days were going to be brutal. That afternoon, I got an email from the management company. It said the HOA was calling an emergency board meeting for Thursday night to address ongoing covenant enforcement issues, and I was required to attend. The email said the meeting would include a vote on final enforcement actions, and failure to attend would result in an automatic decision in favor of the HOA. I forwarded the email to Miguel. He said this was it. This was the meeting where Kathleen would try to force the issue and get the board to approve a lien or a forced sale. He said I needed to bring every piece of evidence I had, and I needed to be ready to drop the trump card if she tried to push it through. I spent the next 2 days preparing. I printed every document in my evidence folder. I organized them into a binder with tabs for each category. Letters, emails, photographs, witness statements, survey discrepancy, original plat, and the recording of Kathleen admitting the management company contract was invalid. I also prepared a short statement explaining why the HOA's actions were unlawful and why the board should reverse the enforcement decision. Miguel reviewed it and said it was solid. He said he would be there to back me up if I needed it. Thursday night came. The community center meeting room was packed. There were at least 30 homeowners in the chairs, more than I had ever seen at a board meeting. Word had gotten out that this was a showdown, and people wanted to see what happened. Kathleen was at the front table with the other board members, and she had a laptop open in front of her. The HOA attorney was sitting beside her, a middle-aged guy in a suit with a briefcase. I signed in at the door and took a seat in the front row. Miguel sat beside me. Linda sat 2 rows back. I could see other neighbors I recognized scattered throughout the room. Kathleen called the meeting to order. She said the board had called the emergency meeting to address a serious and ongoing covenant violation that threatened the safety and property values of the community. She said I had been given multiple opportunities to comply, and I had refused every request. She said the board had no choice but to move forward with enforcement, and the attorney was present to advise the board on the appropriate legal actions. Then she turned to the attorney and asked him to explain the lien process. The attorney opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder. He said the HOA had the authority to place a lien on a property for unpaid fines, and once the lien was recorded, it would attach to the property title and be payable upon sale or refinancing. He said the process required a formal hearing where the homeowner could present evidence, but if the homeowner had already been given notice and an opportunity to respond, the board could proceed with a vote. Kathleen said I had been given multiple notices and had failed to comply. The attorney asked if I had been given a formal hearing with the opportunity to present evidence. Kathleen said I had been given the opportunity to speak at the previous meeting, but I had disrupted the proceedings and refused to cooperate. I stood up. I said that was a lie. I said Kathleen had cut off my speaking time, moved the meeting into executive session, and denied me the right to address the board. I said the bylaws guaranteed homeowners the right to a hearing, and I had not been given one. The attorney looked at Kathleen. He asked her if I had been given a formal hearing with advance notice of the charges and the opportunity to present evidence. Kathleen said the enforcement process had been followed according to board discretion. The attorney said that was not the same thing as a formal hearing, and if the homeowner was disputing the charges, the board needed to hold a hearing before proceeding with a lien. Kathleen's face went tight. She said the hearing was happening right now, and the board was prepared to vote. The attorney said that was not how it worked, and if the board proceeded without a proper hearing, the lien could be challenged in court and the HOA could be liable for damages. Kathleen said the attorney was being overly cautious, and the board had the authority to make enforcement decisions without endless procedural delays. The attorney said he was advising the board on the legal requirements, and if they chose to ignore his advice, they would be doing so at their own risk. I saw my opening. I pulled out the binder and held it up. I said I had documentation that proved the HOA's enforcement actions were based on false information and abuse of process. I said I had the original property plat showing the fence was inside my property line, witness statements showing Kathleen had intimidated neighbors into signing complaints, and evidence that the management company had been operating without a valid contract for over 2 years. I said if the board proceeded with the lien, I would file a lawsuit against the HOA and Kathleen personally for harassment, defamation, and breach of fiduciary duty. The room went silent. Kathleen stared at me. The attorney leaned over and whispered something to her. She shook her head. He whispered again. She said something back, and her voice was sharp. The attorney closed his briefcase and stood up. He said he needed to consult with his client in private, and he was requesting a 10-minute recess. Kathleen said no. The attorney said he was advising the board to recess, and if they did not, he would withdraw from representation. Kathleen looked at him like he had just slapped her. Then she looked at the other board members. One of them said they should take the recess. Kathleen said fine, and she stood up and walked toward the side door. The attorney followed her. Miguel leaned over and said, "I just did it." I just forced the attorney to realize the HOA was exposed, and now he was going to tell Kathleen to back down or he was going to walk. I said I hoped he was right. Miguel said he was sure of it, because attorneys do not walk out of meetings unless they know their client is about to get sued into the ground. 10 minutes later, Kathleen and the attorney came back. Kathleen sat down, and her face was pale. The attorney did not sit down. He said he had advised the board that the enforcement action was not legally supportable based on the documentation provided by the homeowner, and he was recommending the board withdraw the violation notice and the fines. He said if the board chose to proceed, he would be withdrawing from representation effective immediately. Then, he picked up his briefcase and walked out of the room. The room erupted. Homeowners were talking over each other, asking what just happened, asking if the attorney just quit. Kathleen banged her hand on the table and said the meeting was still in order. One of the other board members said they needed to take a vote on whether to proceed. Another board member said they should follow the attorney's advice and withdraw the enforcement. Kathleen said the board had spent months on this case, and they were not going to back down now because one homeowner threatened to sue. The first board member said if the attorney thought the case was weak, they should listen to him. Kathleen said the attorney was overreacting, and the board had the authority to make its own decisions. I stood up again. I said I had one more thing. I pulled out my phone and held it up. I said I had a recording of Kathleen admitting the management company was operating without a valid contract, and that meant every enforcement action taken through the management company was potentially invalid. I said I submit the packet to the HOA attorney and watched the tone change instantly. Kathleen's face went white. She said I had no right to record a private conversation. I said the conversation took place in a public hallway at the community center, and I had every right to record it. Miguel stood up and said he was a witness to the validity of the recording, and he could testify to its authenticity if needed. One of the board members said they needed to see the contract documentation immediately. Another board member said they should call an independent attorney to review the situation. Kathleen said the board did not need to do anything, and this was all a distraction from the real issue. The first board member said the real issue was that the board had been relying on a management company that might not have been properly contracted, and if that was true, the HOA could be liable for every action taken over the past 2 years. Kathleen said that was ridiculous. The board member said they were calling for a vote to withdraw the enforcement action and conduct an independent audit of the management company contract. Kathleen said the motion was out of order. The board member said they were making the motion anyway, and they wanted it on the record. The vote was called. 3 board members voted to withdraw. Kathleen voted no. 1 board member abstained. The motion passed. Kathleen stood up and said the board had just made a huge mistake and she would not be held responsible for the consequences. Then she walked out of the meeting. The remaining board members sat at the table, looking at each other, looking at the homeowners in the audience. One of them said the meeting was adjourned and the board would meet in executive session to discuss next steps. Miguel and I walked out of the community center. I felt like I had just run a marathon. Miguel said I did it. I beat her. I said I did not beat her, I just made her back down. He said that was the same thing, because Kathleen never backed down and the fact that the board voted against her meant she had lost control. I said I would believe it when I got the withdrawal letter. Miguel said I would have it within a week, and if I did not, he would help me file a lawsuit that would bury the HOA in legal fees. 3 days later, I got a certified letter from the management company. It said the HOA board had voted to withdraw the violation notice, the fines, and the enforcement action. It said the matter was closed and no further action would be taken. The letter also said the board had initiated a budget review that reveals vendor favoritism, and they were conducting an independent audit of the management company contract. It said the results of the audit would be shared with homeowners once the review was complete. I read the letter 3 times. Then I called Miguel and told him. He said it was over. I won. A week after that, I got another letter. This one was from the HOA board, signed by the 3 board members who had voted to withdraw. It said the board had completed a preliminary review of the vendor contracts and found multiple irregularities in the approval process. It said the HOA pays the narrators filing fees to end the fight, and they were issuing a formal apology for the enforcement actions taken against me. The letter also said Kathleen had resigned from the board, effective immediately. I read that part twice. Then I called Linda and told her. She said the whole neighborhood was talking about it, and people were saying Kathleen had been pushed out because the other board members realized she was going to get them all sued. The next day, I checked the neighborhood group chat. There was a long thread about the board meeting and Kathleen's resignation. Someone had posted a timeline of her enforcement actions over the past 3 years, and it showed a clear pattern of targeting homeowners who questioned her authority. Karen's group post gets removed and replaced with a correction explaining that the prior enforcement actions had been based on incomplete information, and the board was reviewing all pending cases. The thread had over 100 replies, most of them from homeowners saying they were relieved Kathleen was gone, and they hoped the new board would be more transparent. I never heard from Kathleen again. I saw her once, a few weeks later, driving past my house. She did not look at me. I finished the fence repair, and no one said a word. The new board sent out a notice saying they were revising the covenant enforcement procedures to include clearer guidelines and a formal hearing process for all violations. They also said they were terminating the contract with the old management company and bringing in a new one with transparent billing and oversight. Miguel said it was the best outcome I could have hoped for, because I did not just win my case, I changed the system. I kept the evidence folder. I keep it on my laptop, backed up in 3 places, just in case. I learned that when you are dealing with someone like Kathleen, you do not win by being louder or meaner. You win by keeping records, staying calm, and waiting for them to make a mistake. And they always make a mistake, because people like that think they are untouchable. They are not. They are just bullies with a clipboard. And the second you prove they are wrong, they fold. I hope your notices stay non-existent.